So today we are talking gaming monitors for console players, specifically those that play on either the Xbox Series X or the PlayStation 5. And what I'm gonna do in today's video is list out the best gaming monitors for different budgets, different play styles, and of course, the type of console you play on. Now, it is critical for you to understand what features you need and don't need in your gaming monitor because it is really easy to overspend, especially if you're a console player. And my job is to help you save money on your setup. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, be sure to subscribe to the channel because I have a lot more helpful guides like this that are in the works. So the big thing we all tend to pay attention to when shopping for a gaming monitor is the resolution and the refresh rate. And if you're a total noob to this stuff, the refresh rate on a TV or monitor is the number of times the screen will refresh the picture within 1 second. So if you have a game that is pushing out 120 frames per second, but your screen only has a 60 hertz refresh rate, that means your eyes will only see up to 60 frames per second, despite your game pushing out 120 frames. Right now, both consoles max out at 120 frames per second. That's important to know because you're gonna see a lot of monitors with refresh rates like 165, 240, even 360. And just because you plug that new 240 hertz monitor into your PS5 or Xbox doesn't mean that you're magically gonna get 240 frames per second because both consoles, again, are capped at 120. And in terms of resolution, both consoles support 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. Now, this is the part where you really need to pay attention. You've probably seen the phrase VRR, which stands for variable refresh rate. VRR is very common in PC gaming, and it's much newer for consoles, especially the PS5. Here's an example. When you're playing a game on PC and you watch the frames per second that you are getting, you're gonna notice it's a number that fluctuates up and down. And that's because different moments in the game require more or less resources to render. Now, let's say you have a monitor with a 144 hertz refresh rate. If your game is pushing out, around 115 up and down, but your monitor is locked in at 144 hertz, you're likely going to see what's called screen tearing or stuttering, which makes the game look like crap. That's why most gaming monitors now have stuff like AMD FreeSync or G-Sync built right in, and that lets the monitor and the graphics card talk to each other to be on the same page. In other words, the monitor will adjust the refresh rate to match the frames per second being pushed out by the system. Now remember, VRR is newer to consoles, so the way consoles have historically got around this is they would just lock your frame rate depending on the resolution that you wanted to play in. So the common thing that you would see and still see depending on the game you play is you could play a game at 4K, but because you're at that high resolution, they're gonna lock you in at 60 frames per second. Or you could opt for the higher frames, do 120 frames per second, but your resolution would have to be 1080p or 1440p. Now, that's where variable refresh rate comes in, and the way you can take advantage of that is different depending on your console. If you're an Xbox Series X owner, the solution is very easy. You just need to get a gaming monitor that either has AMD FreeSync built in or the monitor supports HDMI 2.1, which is a newer technology that has VRR built right into it. If you're a PS5 owner, your options are a little more limited and complicated. So on the PS5, in order to use variable refresh rate, you have to have a monitor that has an HDMI 2.1 port. Even if the monitor says it has FreeSync, unless it has HDMI 2.1, you will not be able to use the VRR feature. And since HDMI 2.1 is a newer technology, a lot of TVs and gaming monitors on the market are still HDMI 2.0. Now, there is something important about HDMI 2.1 that all gamers need to understand, including you PC gamers out there. If you look at my fancy chart here, you can see that both connections can support 4K. However, with HDMI 2.0, if you are pushing through a 4K connection, your refresh rate will be capped at 60 hertz. Whereas with the HDMI 2.1, you will be able to get a 120 hertz refresh rate with a 4K connection. That means that if you're wanting to game at a 4K resolution, regardless of whatever you use, you absolutely need to have an HDMI 2.1 display in order to see more than 60 frames per second. Now, technically, this is where DisplayPort enters the chat, but we're talking consoles here and neither console supports that, so we'll talk about that another day. Now, before we get to my monitor recommendations, I do have one more piece of bad news for PS5 gamers. Currently, PlayStation does not allow VRR to be enabled when players want to play at 1440p. So if you are playing at 1440p, you either have to lock in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. My assumption is that sometime in 2023, they'll probably push out some kind of update that will make that available for 1440p, but nothing official yet. So all of that information should allow you to shop more confidently for a monitor, and might I suggest going to techaudit.tv, which is a free tool gamers can use to find the best deals for their gaming setups. But for the sake of today's video, I went ahead and did all of the research for you, and I've got some solid monitors, which I will link to down below. So first up is this 27-inch monitor from MSI, and this is for the budget player on either console that just wants to be as competitive as possible for as cheap as possible. So with this, you'll be playing at 1080p, but you'll be able to get that max 120 FPS every single time, assuming your game supports it. And assuming that this is going to be a monitor sitting on a desk setup, I think 27 inches is a great size. And in my opinion, it's the biggest I would go on a 1080p resolution. Now this one's just a dang good deal. So this is a 27-inch monitor from Skeptor, and it's a nice balanced monitor, especially if you're an Xbox player, because the FreeSync on this will allow you to have that variable refresh rate even at 1440p. And for you PS5 players, even though you won't get variable refresh rate with this particular monitor, you will be able to play games at that nice 1440p resolution. Just lock it in at 120 hertz, assuming the game you're playing supports it. Plus, if you're the type that also likes to play PC games, this monitor can be a great dual purpose monitor for your PC that will be able to take advantage of those higher refresh rates on this. So all around, I mean, PC or console, this is a great monitor deal. Now this one here is basically the same as the last monitor with the exception of the size. So you're jumping up from 27 inches to 32 inches. If you don't care about 4K like the last one, you just want to have a monitor that is a good size monitor for using, but you also just want to sit back in your chair, relax, have a good time. This is a great size to do that. Now, for those of you who want the full shebang, you want 4K at 120 hertz capability, or maybe you're on PS5 and you really want that variable refresh rate, be prepared for a little bit of sticker shock because the price is going to jump up for HDMI 2.1. And whether or not that's worth it is debatable by many, because there are still a lot of games that do not support 4K at 120 frames per second. And in fact, it's a very, last I checked, I think there was like 3 games that actually support both that resolution and that refresh rate at the same time. Now, with all that said, this is still a pretty good buy because with this monitor, we've got HDMI 2.1 with a 4K display. So on both consoles, you're gonna be able to game at 4K and take advantage of that variable refresh rate. So this is one of those more future-proof monitors that's gonna become more and more valuable as more games start to support those higher refresh rates. And even though $600 is a lot, considering the specs of this thing and the fact that it's a nice, comfortable 32 inches, this is a pretty good buy, in my opinion, assuming 4K is important to you. And yes, you can still play games in 1440p and all that, so it's not like you're just restricted to playing in 4K on this. It just means it can support up to 4K. Now, this last monitor I'm throwing in here, it is not for everybody. If you are a player who is dead set on playing 4K and you don't care that you're gonna be capped at 60 frames per second, this is a more affordable option to get that 4K. And even if you play games at 1440p or 1080p on this, you're still going to be capped at 60 frames per second because it is a 60 hertz monitor. But it's a gaming monitor that gets you 4K without having to pay the typical 4K price tag. Having said that, if 4K 60 FPS is your thing, I would honestly just suggest getting a 4K TV since 60 hertz is pretty standard on there, and you can get some pretty nice TVs even in this $300 price range. Obviously, use the Tech Audit TV website. I'll link to that below, but there's a lot of great deals going on for TVs with these kind of specs. Now hit that thumbs up if this video was helpful, and if you want more nitty-gritty details about shopping for monitors, I have put together a really big in-depth guide on gaming monitors in general. You know, it's great for PC players obviously, but even you console players, you're gonna learn a thing or two in that. Enjoy.